Antonio had just turned 75, but he felt much younger. This is what happens when a person is at peace with himself and not in conflict with the outside world. Antonio had lived all his life in a pleasant home that he had proudly built himself. He dreamed of becoming a farmer, but at his advanced age, this proved impossible and became a completely unattainable goal. Antonio tried not to dwell on it and never gave up hope for the future. Those who knew Antonio understood the real reason for his failures as children. They believed that others were to blame for their happiness. Carolina and Daniel were born a year apart and were deeply loved by their parents. All was well until they became teenagers. Daniel was the first to have problems. He often got into trouble because of his poor performance in school and frequent truancy. According to some reports, Daniel was involved with gangs and engaged in highly suspicious activities at night. For whatever reason, the teenager managed to escape the consequences. When the police got involved, Antonio tried to talk to his son. Unfortunately, nothing good came out of this educational moment. Bianca was the first to realize that her son had gone down a questionable path. He had chosen himself, but like any mother, she continued to help. He was improving and achieving something positive in his life. However, when her daughter Caroline began to repeat her brother's behavior, Bianca became desperate. She couldn't understand how her children had become so insufferable. Of course, the parents made every effort to steer Daniel and Carolina in the right direction, but unfortunately, they failed. Tired of the endless arguments and confrontations, Bianca realized that she couldn't continue living this way. There had been disagreements between Bianca and Antonio before, but eventually they came to a point. Bianca decided that divorce was the best solution for their situation. Bianca's decision put Antonio in a severe state of shock. He had hoped that they could help their children, but when left alone with the problem, he realized that everything was doomed to failure. After the divorce, Antonio faced real problems. His children had already turned off the path and barely graduated from high school. They refused to continue their studies and began to lead a life almost similar to that of Carolyn and Daniel. Abused alcohol and spent their father's hard-earned money. It was rumored that in the meantime Bianca had remarried and started a new life. Antonio did not hold a grudge against her, realizing that he too was responsible for what had happened. As time went on, Carolina and Daniel continued to get into a lot of trouble. Daniel spent time in the county jail, and Carolina had several failed attempts to start a family. Antonio repeatedly pleaded with his children to come to their senses and think about their future. But all was in vain. Eventually, Antonio grew tired of the futile attempts to reason with his children and resigned himself to reality. When he heard a knock on the front door, he immediately realized that his son or daughter had come to ask for money. Being a kind and caring father, he never refused to help his children. He tried to give them everything to make. Unfortunately, Carolyn and Daniel's happiness depended only on having money to buy alcohol and some food. Despite their age, the siblings did not work and behaved as if they were the children of a millionaire. Meanwhile, Antonio lived very modestly to save some money for his children. Deep down, the man realized that he could no longer influence his children, so he tried not to notice their oddities and not to dwell too much on their lifestyle. "Hello, Daddy. How are you?" Carolina asked too quickly. As soon as he opened the door, Antonio started to answer, but he was immediately interrupted by Carolina. "I can see that you're doing well. You even bought a new couch." Antonio lowered his gaze and felt embarrassed. He had indeed bought a new couch because he could no longer sleep on the old one. Because once inside his father's house, Danielle and Carolina began to walk around the house, inspecting and measuring every room. Antonio didn't immediately realize what they were doing, and when he did, he felt uneasy. I have heart problems and need money for surgery, and you really don't need a house this big. After all, it was meant for a family, and you live alone." Carolina started to speak. Antonio wanted to say something, but Daniel picked up where his sister left off. He began to complain about his bad luck and the fact that he was the only one who had taken money from the bank. He didn't mention what the loan was for. Antonio was not in the habit of controlling his children's every move. After all, his daughter's health was at stake, and Daniel could get hurt if he didn't. Given his criminal record, he might even end up in jail. "So what should I do?" Antonio asked. "You don't really have to do anything. We've taken care of everything. A place has been prepared for you. There you can spend time with people your own age and not worry about the future. You will always have food and clean clothes," Daniel said. Antonio pondered Daniel's words. He didn't want to leave his home at that age, but at the same time, he felt bad about not helping his children. Maybe a nursing home wasn't such a bad idea. Daniel's words made some sense. Otherwise, who would take care of him in his old age? Antonio thought he would have a week or two to pack, but Daniel insisted that they pack immediately. "What will happen to my dog?" the man asked anxiously. "We've already taken care of that and found a place for him at the animal shelter," Carolina answered immediately. Antonio felt incredibly bad and guilty because Rex, Antonio's faithful friend for more than 10 years, would have to live out his days in an animal shelter. But, on the other hand, Carolina's health was at risk, and Antonio didn't want to sacrifice it, and he started packing. He was sad, but there was really nothing to pack. He lived modestly. He rarely spoiled himself with new things. The couch was one of the few new things he had bought some time ago, but that it wasn't something he could take with him. That was okay. "Daddy will ask the new owners of the house to buy the couch from you," Carolina comforted her father on the way to the nursing home. Antonio felt very uncomfortable. He worried if he would be able to fit in and make friends at the facility. Meanwhile, Carolina and Danielle were thinking about something else entirely. Mentally, the conspirators were already dividing the money they would receive from the sale of the house. Carolina didn't have any financial problems, and Daniel didn't take out a loan from the bank. The whole thing was a plot to steal money from their father. They had already found buyers, and they just needed to get their father out of the house. Antonio's surprise. The nursing home turned out to be very pleasant. He was immediately surrounded by care, attention, and support. Of course, this facility could replace a real home, but it was definitely better than many other places where the elderly ended up. When they said goodbye, Carolyn and Daniel promised to visit their father in a few days. However, they didn't really plan to visit him. After selling the house, Carolyn and Danielle immersed themselves in a whirlwind of drinking and endless parties with friends and acquaintances. The money from the sale of the house was not enough for long. At the same time, they did not realize that their father had nothing to sell. Weeks flew by like a day for Carolyn and Daniel, who woke up after a booze binge. They realized they had no more money and had to do something. Carolyn suggested that they ask their father for his savings, some of which he had set aside for the funeral. Being a prudent and organized man, Antonio had always set aside a certain amount of money to cover funeral expenses in the event of his passing. Probably many people do this, and Antonio was no exception. Daniel really liked Caroline. It was his idea, as easy money had always appealed to him. While the siblings were coming up with the next story to tell their father, Antonio was working on a plot of land behind the nursing home. It is worth noting that the nursing home was in an incredibly beautiful location. A river ran a short distance from the house, and a lush forest grew on either side of it. It was not easy to build a house there. Only a few privileged people could afford to buy land there. Antonio put on his gardening gloves and noticed out of the corner of his eye that at that moment he was beginning to print roses and remove last year's leaves from the lawn. He saw a woman heading toward a 2-story house, half a kilometer away from the nursing home. Anthony knew that wealthy people could afford to have a house in such an upscale neighborhood. The face of a woman passing by seemed familiar to Antonio. "Bianca, is that you?" Antonio exclaimed in surprise. The woman stopped and looked at Antonio, who was dressed in a work suit. At that moment, a sweet smile appeared on her lips, and Antonio realized, "Yes, it's me." "And how did you end up here?" Bianca asked, still puzzled. Antonio stepped from foot to foot and began to explain that he'd sold the house to pay for Caroline, his surgery, and Daniel's debt. After listening to her ex-husband, Bianca turned pale. Unlike Antonio, she didn't believe Danielle and Caroline's stories. Therefore, without saying a word, she immediately called her assistant, who dealt with all sorts of delicate matters. As it turned out, after her divorce from Antonio, Bianca married an influential businessman who was 15 years older than her. It so happened that they lived together for a very short time. After that, the millionaire passed away, leaving his wife a considerable inheritance. Of course, Daniel and Carolina did not know that their mother was rich and lived in a house that cost a fortune. When Bianca said goodbye to Antonio, she promised to visit him soon, and meeting her ex-wife gave Antonio the warmth. Deep down, he still loved her and hoped that one day they could return to their former life. During the investigation, Bianca found out that Caroline and Daniel were to meet Antonio and at the same time had already managed to squander the money received from the sale of the house. The sly children didn't realize that Bianca would tell Antonio the truth when they visited their father. Antonio already knew about the children's deception. "Daddy, we need some more money." Carolina started, much to Daniel's surprise. Antonio shook his head and said he wouldn't give them anything. "Dad, what do you mean?" At this point, Carolina was stunned. Bianca suddenly appeared, and Daniel and Carolina became visibly uncomfortable. The siblings realized that their lies had been exposed, and they wouldn't be getting any more money. Moreover, Bianca and Antonio decided to live together, saying goodbye to the children, "Live as you wish, but forget the road to our house." Carolina and Daniel could not recover from what they saw for a long time. They couldn't believe their eyes as they watched Bianca, Antonio leave. Despite the couple's age, they decided to make a fresh start. The former couple now had everything that they couldn't even dream of before. Their lives were sure to change for the better. If you like the stories on our channel, give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and put a bell to be the first listeners of another new story. Good luck and come back. It will be interesting.